The Death Note is one of the most dangerous objects in human history, responsible for the death of millions. But whether you accidentally found this notebook or vowed to change the world with it, the end was always the same: horror and tragedy. And so today we're going to go through every user in the Death Note timeline, including one who finally beat L and doomed the human race. Because you might think the Death Note story begins with Light Yagami, but it doesn't. So let's rewind back to 1979 and to Death Note's first ever chapter, its pilot. You see, one day several employees, including the branch and assistant managers at a Japanese bank, suddenly collapsed and died, all of them from heart attacks. Then things got weirder. The final death was a suicide. However, after a bit of digging, investigators then realized that even more people connected to the suicide victim also died of unexplained heart attacks beforehand. And so it's clear that whoever this user was broken mentally by the guilt of his own actions and resulted in ending his own life, hence why this case remains unsolved. Nonetheless, whoever this Death Note user truly was clearly killed co-workers he didn't like. But I mean, well, we've all thought about it at least once, right? But he wasn't the only wielder of a Death Note in the pilot. In fact, it wasn't until decades later that his murders resurfaced when other similar deaths began to happen. Because who else but Ryuk had to go and lose his Death Note in the human realm? But to understand all the chaos that follows, you first need to understand the place that he comes from. As the Shinigami realm isn't a world in any traditional sense. It's more like a graveyard floating in limbo. It really is just a place of nothing, or at least nothing meaningful. Time doesn't feel like it moves forward, it just sort of stagnates, much like the Shinigami who live there. You see, they don't age or dream or evolve, not in most circumstances anyway. They simply just exist until they don't. However, when a Shinigami writes a human's name in their Death Note, the years that human would have lived are added to the Shinigami's own lifespan. And the guy that rules over this entire place is, of course, the King of Death. He's an ancient figure so old that most Shinigami just call him the Old Man. His power is beyond human comprehension, yet he's not this omniscient, benevolent god. He's kind of more like an administrator who just governs the distribution of Death Notes, deciding which Shinigami receive them, when they come into existence, and maintain the overall basic laws of the realm. In spite of that, bro can be taken advantage of in dangerous ways, which we will get onto soon. As in a world of just endless boredom, the Shinigami seek entertainment, thrills, and reasons to live, all by spectating the human world. Thus, Ryuk didn't lose his Death Note, he discarded it out of boredom. And well, what do you know? It fell into the hands of a 13-year-old boy named Taro Kagami. Having not long lost his diary, when he found the Death Note, bro thought that he hit the jackpot, going home to write about his day, including the names of the kids that bullied him. Yeah, you see where this is going. Because despite understanding the English word for note, he didn't know what death meant. Thus was totally unprepared to walk into school the next day to find that his two bullies had kicked the bucket. Now, Taro didn't immediately connect the deaths to his writing because, I mean, let's be real for a sec, why would you? However, as the bullying continued and he carried on writing about it in his supposed diary, he started to realize that some wild shit was going down as they too died from sudden heart attacks. Therefore, as he speed ran his way home to hide the book, he met Ryuk for the first time. The Shinigami explained all the basic rules before the doorbell went and two detectives came to question Taro about the deaths. Ryuk suggested that he should just simply kill them, but Taro refused. I mean, he was scared, don't get me wrong, but he still had a conscience. In a very rare case, the Death Note didn't corrupt him or feed into any power fantasies. Instead, he had nightmares of those that he had killed, which Ryuk actually explained was part of the course. That being said, upon realizing just how traumatic the Death Note was for Taro, Ryuk offered him the Death Eraser. Now, this is a pilot exclusive item that never made its way into the main story, thankfully, but it's still pretty cool. You see, it's capable of reviving anyone killed by the Death Note as long as they haven't been cremated yet. Thus, Taro immediately got to work reviving those that he had killed. But of course, this is all way too boring for Ryuk, right? And so, the next day at school, when those revived bullies were questioned by the detectives, they all suddenly died of heart attacks again. Taro didn't even have his death note on him, but that's when Ryuka remembered his second notebook. It had been found by Miura, another bullied kid from Taro's school. But unlike Taro, who committed murders by accident and felt the guilt, Miura acted out of desperation, just writing everyone down. Anyone who scared my guy was dead. But when Taro figured out that he was the one using Ryuka's other death note, he raced to his house, where Miura was then ready to write Taro's name down for getting in the way, claiming that he'd then write his own down after. In spite of this, Taro stopped him from going ahead with it and even used the death eraser again to revive everyone that Miura had killed. Furthermore, to make amends for the crimes they had committed, both boys explained the truth to the detectives, with Taro even offering to be temporarily killed and revived to prove the Death Note's power, which he does. That being said, Taro clearly wasn't open to the idea of fully disposing of the Death Note, making up a lie that Miura had the only notebook. As a result, that book was burnt and kept a total secret, worried that the news of a real Death Note would cause widespread panic. In spite of this, rumors of such a superpower still spread. Nonetheless, Taro kept hold of his in secret for 7 years, and not once during that time did he use it, being an extremely rare example of someone using the notebook and managing to survive with their soul still intact. However, there was still more murders committed via the powers of the Shinigami realm before Light got cooking. I'm talking about the Another Note BB murder case novel, which I actually have right here. It is the official prequel covering the case in LA where Naomi Misora first worked with L. If you want to grab one for yourself, then you can just check our affiliate link down below. I binged it all in a couple days, honestly, for this video. I gotta say, it's actually a bit of a banger. That being said, spoilers up ahead for it next, because I'm talking about Beyond Birthday. You see, whilst he may not have committed his killings via a death note, I still want to mention him as he did have the Shinigami eyes. Not via the usual deal in return for half that person's lifespan though. He'd had them since he was a baby. The only hypothesis that Mello could come up with was that, much like how Shinigami dropped their book, they dropped their eyes too. All just for a laugh, I guess. Nonetheless, this was the first war L had with a serial killer connected to the powers of a Shinigami. That's because Beyond Birthday, also known as B, was groomed as a potential successor to L at Wateri's Whammy house until he went rogue. You see, being born with the ability to be able to see the names of everyone and their death sent him mad, transformed him into a twisted, strange, albeit genius that had what it took to one day replace L. In spite of this, Beyond Birthday actually became obsessed with L, and so in 2002 he set into motion a grand plan to finally defeat him and become the world's greatest criminal by giving the greatest detective an unsolvable case. Come on, you. Let's... What's that? Oh, you said subscribe. However, B knew L wouldn't appear physically to solve these murders. He would just send someone else as a stand-in, that person being Naomi Misora. Thus, Beyond Birthday adopted a new persona. His fascination with L had transformed him into him. He used the alias Ryuzaki, wore the same clothes as L, used makeup to put pitch black bags under his eyes, styled his hair the same, copied every one of his mannerisms such as biting his thumbnails, eating crazy amounts of sugar, and, of course, sitting with his legs tucked up to his chest for better detective capability. He truly was reborn as the fake L. And so, Beyond Birthday tagged along with Naomi Misora in the investigation as a supposed private detective, helping point her as far as he could to the scene of the final murder himself. Yep, that's right. Beyond Birthday aimed to light himself on fire in the hopes that it would make himself totally unrecognizable and throw out all logic of the killings, creating the unsolvable case he dreamed of. In spite of this, B underestimated Naomi. She solved the case at the final moment, figuring out that it was Ryuzaki behind it all, putting out the fire before it could finish him off. Of course, this meant that the L wannabe, Beyond Birthday, spent the rest of his days in jail. However, if only he could have seen his own lifespan with the Shinigami eyes, as it wouldn't be long before he mysteriously died in his cell from a heart attack. His killer, of course, being Kira. However, at this point, the world didn't know that yet. After all, Light Yagami seemed like your standard 17-year-old top student in Japan. He was extremely intelligent, hardworking, and adults constantly glazed him for his genius. But little did they realize, they were actually glazing a monster. All this ass-licking led to an arrogant side. Light felt superior to everyone and began to grow bored with life, despite the insane amounts of success that he was destined to enjoy. After all his perfections were ruined by an imperfect world, a rotten world. Thus, he set out on a journey to cleanse that world, to become the god of a new world. Even when bro thought the Death Note was nothing but an intricate little prank, Light still went to town, filling pages upon pages with names on the off chance that it meant he could achieve his goal. You see, it took 5 days for Ryuk to find Light, yet in that time, he had already become a total serial killer. I mean, just look at this, right? Light writes 5 columns or so of names, presumably on both pages. There's 38 lines per page, and he wrote in all of them. So that is 380 murders already. In less than a week, Light Yagami had already become the biggest serial killer in human history. Now, out of these 380 odd killings, only one wasn't a heart attack, and that was the sexual assaulter Light had run over as the test to see just what would happen. The reason for this is because Light wanted all criminals to understand that somewhere, somehow, somebody was passing righteous judgment on their evil. Then, once Light manages to put an end to that in the world, he'd move on to other kinds of evil. Those Light deemed immoral will be given terminal diseases. And so eventually this god complex and savior mentality gave birth to Kira, a mystical entity that would forever change the human race. As people soon began connecting the dots that criminals were being punished, causing the public to grow both fearful and oddly hopeful, even going as far to worship their new god. After all, the ends justify the means. However, it of course doesn't go unanswered for long, as the man, the myth, the legend, L himself swiftly suspects that Kira is hiding in Japan, and he was right. But this is more than just one of the greatest rivalries and battles in all of anime. It fuels Light's god complex even more than the Death Note already had done. Now, in his eyes, those who stand in Kira's way, be it police, detectives, those that are innocent, are actually evil, thus marked for death by Light Yagami. And the first victim of that vindication is none other than our next user, Reye Penber. He was part of a team of FBI agents sent to investigate key individuals in the Kira case and got assigned to follow Light. However, after days went by, Reye saw nothing out of the ordinary. In fact, he was all but ready to report Light's innocence. But Kira had already noticed that he was being tailed and formulated a plan. He used the Death Note to arrange for a criminal to hijack a bus that he and Reye were on, all to get Reye to show Light his badge. But there was more. Remember that the Death Note allows for the method of death to also be included. And so, to tie up loose ends, Light gets the hijacker to die via a speeding car after being scared away by Ryuk. But despite actually learning his name by doing this, Light didn't want to take any chances. He confronted Reye in the subway, passing him a piece of the Death Note and an earpiece. After Light proved that he was Kira, he forced the FBI agent to become a Death Note killer by proxy, as Light made him write down all the other FBI agents who came to Japan, unknowingly killing his own allies one by one, hoping to save his and his wife's life. Nonetheless, Light still goes ahead and kills both him and Naomi after she tries to get involved with the case, only highlighting the death brain rot that Light was getting from doing all this, killing multiple innocents now, all in the name of God. Thus, of course, L began to get more suspicious. After all, the fact that Kira got rid of his FBI pursuers can only mean that he was one of those being pursued. Even more than that, he must have had access to police information, therefore, he began to look into those connected to the team working on the case, taking him straight to Light Yagami. Little did L realize just how confusing things were about to get though. Bringing us onto Misa Amane, who couldn't be more different from Light really. She was an up-and-coming model and actress, but more importantly, the second Kira. In fact, her entire journey ties back to the Shinigami realm, as it wasn't just humans that simped for her. You see, a Shinigami named Jealous literally gooned to death to save her life, an act forbidden by the King of Death. Nonetheless, his comrade Rem delivered his now ownerless notebook to Misa as he would have wanted. Thus, In a way, fate chose for her to end up as the second Kira. It was destiny for her, and so Rem felt obliged to watch over Misa and learn why Jealous fell so in love, an act which turned Rem into a Shinigami goonette. Long before this though, Misa's own infatuation with the god began, as her parents' killer was murdered by Kira, and so to her, justice had been served where the legal system had failed. This love-driven mentality made both her devoted and dangerous, forcing her to undergo the ideal with Rem. This of course meant she couldn't see the lifespan of another Death Note user, meaning she soon discovered Light and fell in love after drawing his attention via a series of videotapes and love letters addressed to the media, committing murders in Kira's name. For Light though, Misa was a bit of a double-edged sword. On one hand, the Shinigami eyes could be the way to finally kill L, but on the other, she was an unpredictable fangirl with a Death Note that could do anything at any moment. All that truly mattered though was that Misa was a tool for Kira. Things went totally pear-shaped though when L caught onto their relationship, subsequently leading him and the task force to trace the second Kira's broadcasts back to Misa, ending in her arrest. Like the devoted lover she is though, she withstood days of interrogation without giving Light's secret up. Listen, my guy has to be packing some serious heat down there or something, because this level of devotion is just crazy. And you'll see later on too that it wasn't even just Misa risking it all for a bit of that light D. Because even when Misa is pushed to the brink of dehydration and madness, she begs for death rather than betray Light. In spite of this, Rem heard Misa's cries and forced her to relinquish ownership of the Death Note, causing her to lose all memory of being the second Kira, ultimately protecting Light through an act of self-defense. Still, Light was in trouble. L had evidence and even suspected that he was Kira. Plus, Light didn't have Misa's eyes to save him anymore either. Thus, he resorted to a new plan, to be jailed and monitored while surrendering the Death Note just like Misa had in the process. But he also left himself a trail of breadcrumbs to once again become Kira. But first, for that, he needed a new Kira to be born, one that he could help L track down in order to prove his innocence. Thus, before losing his memories, Light ordered Rem to find a greedy, ambitious man in a powerful organization who would kill criminals as the new Kira. That man turned out to be Kyosuke Higuchi. He was exactly the kind of Kira Light wanted the world to see. A greedy corporate vulture who used the notebook for insider trading and office power plays, wiping out business rivals and those who stood in his way of success. However, unlike Light, who faked affection for Misa to use her, Higuchi actually had a bit of a genuine lust for her. He wanted the power that came with marrying a girl like her, the celebrity, the beauty, the status symbol, the flex of a young model babe, and the Death Note was his path to doing so. In spite of this, it also marked his end. Rem stepped in behind the scenes and gave Misa a little bit of the Death Note to let us see Rem again. With that power-up, Misa convinced Higuchi that she was the second Kira, tricking him into revealing his identity as Kira likewise. What he didn't know though was that Misa had been recording the entire confession for the task force. Eventually a sting operation was launched, and when Higuchi panicked, he did what desperate notebook owners do. He made the ideal with Rem. After all, his identity as Kira was going to be revealed on live television, and if that happened, his life would be over anyway. Thus, he stormed Sakura TV HQ to try and use the eyes to kill Matsuda on live TV, only to find that it was a phony setup. Then learning that Higuchi had the Shinigami eyes after killing a police officer, the task force covered their faces and backed him into a corner, where, with no hope remaining, Higuchi spilled the Death Note secrets out loud. Thus, one by one, they all began touching the notebook, learning that Shinigami existed, even L. But most importantly was that Light touched it, and with it came back all his memories, turning him into Kira once again. He remembered a torn piece of the book that he had hidden in his watch and quietly wrote Higuchi's name on it in blood, watching the now third Kira drop dead before he could reveal all. Nonetheless, the task force had their hands on a Death Note, along with all the supposed rules, including albeit they weren't to know it, 2 fake rules written in the back by Ryuk designed to prove Light and Misa's innocence. And this might sound a bit strange at first, but hang in there, as its next user was set to be none other than L. Kinda. You see, he still suspected Light and Misa of being the original Kiras. Thus, to prove it, he focused on debunking the 13-day rule. This was a fake rule claiming that anyone who used the Death Note had to write another name within 13 days, or they would die. Since Light and Misa had been detained for over 50 days and were still alive, most of the task force believed that proved their innocence. But not L. He wanted concrete proof that this rule was fake, so he devised a test. Give the notebook to a death row inmate, have them write the name of another death row inmate, and then wait 13 days to see what happens. This move, however, sent Rem into total panic mode. There was already plenty of suspicion around Misa, and if the 13-day rule was proven false, it would completely blow her cover and end her life. So, in a desperate attempt to protect Misa, Rem repeated the same thing Jealous did and saved her by writing L's true name in the Death Note, sacrificing herself. And so you could argue that L planning to use the notebook for his experiment indirectly led to both his and Rem's death, putting Light in a seemingly unlosable position. And well, for a bit that was the case. He became the new L after his death and ruled the world as the new god. But then the real L successors entered the fray, Nia and Mello. That being said, they couldn't have been more different. Nia was calm, quiet, logical, a lot like L really, whereas Mello was emotional, impulsive, and above all, hated losing, especially to Nia. Thus, he refused to work with him on the Kira case and left to solve it alone, becoming one of the Mafia's leaders. It's then he realizes that the only way to truly fight Kira is to get a Death Note of his own. And so he has the Mafia kidnap Soichiro Yagami, Light's little sister, and demands the Death Note as a ransom. Thus, Soichiro Yagami, their father, had no choice but to hand it over, bringing us onto our next user, Y462. He is one of the darkest and coldest parts of Mello's entire plan, as he's basically the Mafia's masked enforcer. A gimp masked enforcer, but an enforcer nonetheless. He is the man who meets Soichiro Yagami for the trade-off, where he tests if it is real by killing Miller, a random Mafia bozo standing nearby. Then, to wipe out every possible witness who could tie the operation back to the Mafia, Y462 kills the man who escorted Soichiro to America for the trade, as well as the pilot for the flight. But really, Y462 should have known that life wouldn't have been that easy for him. Because whilst Rod Ross, the Mafia boss, promised Y462 that if he handled this operation perfectly, all of his past failures would be forgiven, it was all a lie. Shock. And so, as soon as Y462 loads the Death Note into a missile for transport, his ass is killed by Cal Snyder, aka Jack Neylon. Talking of which, he becomes the notebook's next owner. Now, it's worth noting that Mello also handles the notebook a lot whilst the Mafia have it. However, by, I don't know, Death Note law, Jack is the rightful owner. Because of this, he sees Sido, the Shinigami this notebook belongs to. And well, he shits himself, as you would. However, it is through Sido that the group learns about the Shinigami Eyes trade, which Mello immediately orders Jack to agree to, as Rod Ross, the Mafia leader, points a gun to Jack's head, leaving him pretty much no choice. In spite of this, using her own Shinigami Eyes, Misa scans through the FBI database of Mafia suspects and, upon seeing Jack's photograph, realizes he must be a Death Note user because she can't see his lifespan. Therefore, now knowing who owns Sido's notebook, Light uses Misa's Death Note to force Jack to secretly mail him the address of Mello's Mafia hideout. Then, using that info, a US Special Forces team raids the base. However, security cameras capture the soldiers' exposed faces and show them on monitors inside the hideout, allowing Jack to read their names aloud to Ross, who writes them into the notebook. But of course, what Jack doesn't realize is that his fate has already been sealed, as when Light used the Death Note to get him to write the address, he of course had to write his death 2, which occurred at midnight that night along with Ross and the other Mafia members thanks to Soichiro Yagami's eyes. That's right, Jack wasn't the only one who made that ideal, as after handing over the Death Note, Soichiro became depressed and suicidal due to the guilt he felt. And so, to help with the task force's raid on the Mafia, he accepts Ryuk's deal so that he could learn Mello's real name and write his name in the Death Note. In spite of this, the fact he's never killed anyone before in his life stops him at the final moment. He wrote his first name, but couldn't go through with writing the second. And so a gunshot from Jose and a bomb planted inside the hideout by Mello leaves Soichiro critically wounded in the hospital. And despite Light's best efforts to get his dad to write Mello's name in the Death Note before he dies, it's no use. Whilst he was left feeling like he had lost though, his father couldn't be happier. Using the Shinigami eyes, he could see Light's lifespan, and as Light had given up ownership of the notebook again prior to this, Soichiro could die happy, believing that his son was indeed not Kira. And listen, whilst he was most definitely affected deeply by the Death Note, he is an extremely rare case of someone being able to actually die happy in this scenario. Nonetheless, whilst Light thought that his name would be cleared, Nia soon began to suspect him and Misa once again of being the original Kiras. And so Light forced Misa to relinquish ownership of the Death Note one last time, but not before getting Ryuk to pass it on to Light's next pawn, Mikami, the Hand of Kira. Who, by the way, if you didn't notice, is actually Taro Kagami from the pilot chapter, or his design is the same as time skip Taro Kagami at least. The author, in fact, even confirmed it. Nonetheless, the reason Mikami was chosen to become the new Angel of Death was because of his intense devotion. You see, where Misa viewed Kira as a lover, Mikami actually viewed him as a god, and it was all thanks to his childhood. You see, even as a child, Mikami was watching the people around him and sorting them into groups of good and evil. Thus, when bullies targeted his classmates, he fought back and protected those who needed it until his whole class eventually united behind him and the bullying stopped. But everything changed in middle school. Mikami could no longer scrap with the bigger kids, and so it was his ass getting whooped left and right. And that's just when his sense of justice began to twist. Instead of wanting to help people, he started wishing his bullies would simply die. His mother begged him to stop. However, as far as Mikami was concerned, she had betrayed him, his own mother. Thus, he began to hate her too. Nonetheless, she soon died in a car accident along with 4 of his bullies. And whilst he mourned his mother's death, he was also relieved that the evil around him had been wiped away. It was the start of a new world, one that Kira helped build. And so once he was older and Kira had become the new god of the new world, Mikami joined Kira's kingdom and even appeared on TV as a loyal supporter of his beliefs, defending Kira publicly in hopes that one day Kira would notice him. And eventually, now acting as Kira's proxy, Mikami got to work on his behalf. When one of Light's Kira spokespersons began using his newfound fame to scam other Kira loyalists, Mikami got to work killing them all on live television after taking Ryuk's Shinigami ideal. However, this meant Kira, of course, needed a new spokesperson, and her name just so happened to be Kiyomi Takada, Light's ex. A purely coincidental choice by Mikami almost gave Light the dub. As the 3 of them communicated cryptically between each other to fulfill the will of Kira, they prepared their final plan to kill Nia once and for all and achieve Light's perfect victory. And so, a fake Death Note was created, which Mikami uses in public so that Nia's task force knew that he was the man known as ex-Kira. In reality though, it was a different Kira doing the killings on pages from the real Death Note. Being the public voice of Kira and someone Light knew personally meant that he could get daily meetings with her under the guise of it being a wiretapped sting operation to get secrets about Kira from her. In reality though, it was Light passing secret written messages guiding her every move. However, when the final stage of Light's plan began, Mello kidnapped Takada. What he wasn't aware of though was that she had a hidden scrap of the Death Note in her bra and used it to kill him. In spite of this, her fate had already been sealed. Once she got in touch with Light to explain what had happened, he gave the order to carry out as many killings as she could whilst she could. However, once she called Mikami and explained she needed criminals to kill, he set out on a mission of his own to kill Takada. He did so to try and protect Kira's secrets, ordering her her to light everything on fire, killing herself and burning the paper she wrote on. But this was the exact moment Light's plan failed completely, as he had also written Takada's name, getting her to do the same thing just 1 minute earlier. I mean, Light seriously thought that he could puppeteer Takada, Mikami, Misa, and even Nia all at the same time, and couldn't have been more wrong. As whilst Mikami was dealing with Takada, Nia took the chance to swap the real notebook with a perfectly forged copy. And so, at the final showdown, Mikami, using his Shinigami eyes, wrote down the name of everyone except his god. Light had finally lost. The fact that his name was the only one absent exposed his true identity, leading to his plan failing and his name being written in the Death Note by Ryuk. Mikami's fate, on the other hand, is a bit of a different story. You see, in the anime, Mikami killed himself to try and create one last distraction for Light to try and escape, but in the manga, it was totally different. After Light went crazy from losing, Mikami realized that his god was just a desperate human and lost faith. But this is actually where things get really interesting and bring us onto a possible secret Death Note user. Because you see, after being arrested, Mikami mentally broke down in prison, where just 10 days later, he suddenly died. Strange, right? Well, Matsuda theorizes that Nia used the notebook to control Mikami. And I mean, it kind of makes sense. I mean, just think about it for a second, right? Mikami was obsessively careful, something even Light noticed and found borderline creepy. He checked the Death Note on a microscopic level and never acted without absolute certainty. But he just rushes in headfirst without thinking anything could go wrong when it came to the final showdown. That's why Matsuda's theory suggests that Nia had already written Mikami's name in the real Death Note that they took from him and used it to not only kill Mikami in prison 10 days later, but more importantly, to put a command in there that he couldn't question the validity of the Death Note that he was using. It's probably why they refused to arrest him before then, despite having the evidence they needed to prove that he was Kira. And I gotta admit, I think Matsuda might be cooking here, because the fact that Nia claims that they perfectly replicated everything from the torn pages to the handwriting, even the stains and marks present in one day. Okay, yeah, sure thing, buddy. Whatever you say, I guess. Come on, I don't care if he's a boy genius. That is total shit. When you think of the fact that Light believed he couldn't lose because Nia was too noble in how he approached things, it makes sense that, well, in actuality, Nia had to resort to the least noble thing of all and use the notebook himself. Hence why he burned the remaining ones. Yes, so that nobody else could use them, but also to hide the evidence that he wrote Mikami's name in it, as Matsuda theorizes. However, there's actually more to this, and that is the fate of Misa. You see, it's revealed by the author that Misa eventually committed suicide a year after Light's death. Was that Nia, or was it, as the author suggests, Matsuda accidentally letting slip the truth? I think it's exactly that, as realistically, N had no reason to kill her, and unless he kept a piece of the notebook with him after burning them, the rules state you can only control someone's actions for 23 days max, so kind of impossible. Worth noting as well that Misa herself literally said she couldn't imagine a world without Light at the beginning, and that she'd bite the bullet if anything ever happened to him. So I think that pretty much answers that theory. But I knew some of you were going to bring it up anyway, so ha! However, whilst the public believed Kira was simply taking a break from passing righteous judgment, with even cults being formed to worship him, someone would eventually take up his mantle. See Kira. You see, a Shinigami named Midora bribed the Shinigami King with 13 apples to receive an extra Death Note. This is what I mean about how the King of Death could be taken advantage of in dangerous ways. A few apples is enough to give you the most powerful weapon in human history, which is exactly how Ryuk ended up with 3 Death Notes. Thus, once Midora got her extra, she set off for the human world to try and have fun, just like Ryuk did. This new Kira, however, unlike Light, didn't target criminals or seek justice or to become God. They targeted elderly people who just wanted to die due to their poor health, claiming that he was relieving them of their pain, causing Japan to go from the country with the longest life expectancy down to 6th. However, Nia deduced that the new Kira was more than likely nothing but a youngster who thought by killing the elderly he would bring prosperity to his own generation. And so as far as Nia was concerned, this was nothing but a selfish Kira wannabe like Higuchi, thus refused to get involved with the case, claiming that it was nothing more than a cheap Kira, hence the title Sea Kira. That being said, he did try and approach it as L would, as N's way of countering the Death Note was going to be to release its existence publicly, allowing cops to search everyone in the country for it, albeit causing widespread panic. But once this Sea Kira killed those who worship him on live television, those who wanted to be killed by him, Nia appeared on TV as L, announcing that he had no interest in this case, declaring the new Kira as nothing but a murderer. Hearing this, Sea Kira simply stared at his bedroom for 3 days, frozen with fear, before eventually succumbing to an emotional breakdown, writing his own name in the Death Note. This actually then led Ryuk into getting his 4th notebook, as Midori decided that the human world wasn't as fun as he made it out to be, thus gave him her spare that the Sea Kira used. Ryuk then returned for a bit more fun, as in 2017 he chose a genius called Minoru to be the new Light Yagami. He told them about the true Kira and how he used the Death Note. However, whilst impressed by how Light managed to manipulate the Death Note's rules in his favor, Minoru also admitted that Kira's tactics would be impossible today due to surveillance technology advancing way too far, though perhaps Light would have even still found a way regardless. The bottom line was, however, that Minoru wasn't interested in using the Death Note to create a new world or kill anyone for that matter. He came up with a completely new plan, relinquishing ownership of the Death Note, telling Ryuk to return in exactly 2 years when he was ready. And so in 2019, with his memories returned, Minoru revealed that he was going to sell the Death Note. He got Ryuk to announce on Sakura TV that Kira's power would be auctioned on Twitter under the hashtag Power of Kira, with bids to be placed in US dollars. This auction earned him the name A Kira by Nia. And so after days of a bidding war that reached his 1 quadrillion yen, the United States of America, under the leadership of Donald Trump, wins the election. Wins the auction. Winning the election was a genuine fuck up. It just came natural. However, to avoid being found, Minoru orders the USA to deposit the payment into the savings account of anyone under 60 with a Yotsuba bank account in equal amounts, before then relinquishing ownership of the Death Note back to Ryuk, who takes it to the president. In spite of this, the Shinigami King finally put his foot down. No amount of apples was saving Ryuk's ass from getting in trouble this time. Therefore, a new rule was added. Anyone who buys and sells the Death Note will die. Thus, Donald Trump refused to take ownership of the notebook, however, still declared publicly that he held the power of Kira, vowing to never use it in order to make himself look like a saint in the eyes of the human race. Therefore, yes, the president was a Death Note user in name, but name only. Minoru, on the other hand, still used the Death Note in his own way, thus Ryuk wrote his name down right next to Light Yagami, killing him. However, Minoru's plan was flawless, right? I mean, even Nia, L himself, admitted defeat. Well, about that. Only around 1% or less of the Japanese population would have met all the criteria to receive the money from the Death Note sale. Hundreds of thousands of people becoming billionaires overnight would first spark crazy amounts of inflation. We even see how people immediately start splashing what they could on houses, cars, whatever. And so prices would shoot up, leaving the other 99% of the Japanese population with no hope whatsoever. It would lead to immediate economic divides amongst the people, leading to hate being spread across the country. Also, hundreds of thousands quitting their jobs overnight would make Japan's already existing job market completely collapse. I mean, they don't even have enough workers IRL already, and that's not even covering the catastrophic effect that it would have on the United States of America as well. After all, that $10 trillion has to come from somewhere, and that somewhere would of course be the American taxpayers. Therefore, if 99% of the Japanese population have no way to financially support themselves anymore, and those in the USA are now also destined to have their tax bills skyrocket, it would undoubtedly lead to a mass global depression, and likely an obscene amount of people taking their own lives. And so, Minoru Tanaka may have accidentally caused the deaths of more people than even Light Yagami himself could have ever dreamed of. But talking of Light, what actually happened to him after his death? Well, he may have become a Shinigami himself. Want to find out the evidence as to how? Well, all you've got to do is check this video out on your screen right now.